Welcome to episode 56 of the Tax Professionals podcast. This episode provides an insight into how guest Chris Maslin has created successful tax businesses for episode 8 of Tax Career Success Secrets, where experienced tax professionals share the secrets behind their career success.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Chris, a chartered accountant and tax advisor, set up his own practice, Maslins, in 2009 after working for a few accountancy firms in both audit and corporation tax. In June 2021, Chris transferred the ownership of Maslins to an employee ownership trust and took a step back from the business. But what was his journey up until this point? In the beginning, Chris ignored advice he received from a fellow business owner, which he later realised was a mistake. It meant he found it difficult to get clients initially, but he had a breakthrough which completely changed this for him and made him realise he should have listened to the advice he received. He tells the story in this episode. He also shares his experience of hiring staff and supporting trainees. Chris has established two other businesses, MVL Online and GoEO. The services for both of these businesses include tax as an element. For MVL Online, tax is certainly a key driver, but not the only reason clients decide to utilise the service. In the case of GoEO, tax is a nice added extra. I know in my first few years of working in tax, I thought that the whole service that we as tax advisors must provide should be purely related to tax, and I disliked anything that strayed away from that. But the reality is that we provide much more value to our clients when we can provide a wider service, giving them something that is practical and commercial. I hope that this is something that you can take away from this episode, as Chris's businesses are a great example and reminder of this. The episode starts off by Chris giving an overview of his tax career and why he decided to set up his own practice. We then move on to how Chris went about getting his first clients and what he learned from this, before moving on to how to support and help trainees develop without compromising the work that you need to do. We then move on to why he decided to transfer ownership of Maslins to an employee ownership trust. And he also talks to us about how he took a step back from the business. We then talk about how Chris has created his other businesses, and he shares with us how he has done this. The episode finishes with Chris's career advice that he'd give to his younger self, knowing what he knows now, and his advice to people who are early on in their tax careers. Rough timings for each of these can be found in the details section of this episode within your podcast player, or by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP56. You can find all other episodes of Tax Career Success Secrets by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TCSS. That's /TCSS, and that just stands for Tax Career Success Secrets. We've been joined by past AOT presidents Heather Self, Kate Rothwell, and many other great guests too. Every episode has a slightly different focus. The link mentioned will also be within the show notes. Just before we jump into this episode, if like me, you're interested in knowing what you're worth in terms of salary, then get in touch with James at the Tax Recruitment Company to benchmark what you're currently on. From his interaction with many different businesses and tax professionals, he has current knowledge of salary rates based on experience and specialism. You can contact James on 07768 252 252 at j.howell@thetaxrecruitmentcompany.co.uk, or book a call with him via thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat to benchmark your salary or discuss potentially available roles, particularly if you work in corporation tax, as he's recruiting for many roles in this area. You don't need to remember James's contact details, as they're included in the details section of your podcast player and in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP56. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. Could you just start off then, Chris, by telling us a little bit about you and your tax career?
So I'm Chris Maslin. I graduated in economics and I trained as a chartered accountant with the firm Tennant, or Tennant as they were then. They no longer exist. So that was in the early 2000s, and probably like most trainees, I started in audit. But the firm were quite good to me, and over the 3 years that I was there, I did drift around a few different departments. Around the time I qualified as a chartered accountant, I got lured by the big salaries of central London. And also when it comes to tax, one of the things I'd noticed is that whilst working in audit, we'd go out, we'd do a lot of work, or what seemed like a lot of work, but we didn't really add a lot of value to the client. They'd give us a set of accounts. We'd give them back 2 weeks later with a big tick at the bottom and say, here's your invoice for £10,000. And they'd grumble a bit at that. Whereas when the tax partner got involved, he might spend what superficially to me seemed like an hour jotting down some thoughts on a letter, give that to them. That saves them 20 grand in tax, and they happily pay £5,000 for that without batting an eyelid, and they're delighted. So that's what drew me to tax. And I went to work for Baker Tilly in corporate tax, doing my chartered tax advisor's exams. So yeah, I did that for a couple of years afterwards.
Yeah, it's an interesting point actually about the difference between kind of audit and tax, because I would say there are some areas of tax where you can see as adding value to your client, but then there's still obviously the compliance side as well. But obviously in audit, you don't really get that luxury to have the value add ever.
Exactly. And you know what? I think my job at Baker Tilly proved my naivety. It was a compliance role, and I don't think in any way they misled me. It was more just I had a naive view of what I was getting into. So I think in my head, I was going to be sitting around a big table with a bunch of eggheads dreaming up crazy tax avoidance schemes or things along those lines, when reality, tax compliance is pretty much a case of copy the numbers from the accounts, paste them into the tax software, and it's just making sure you know which numbers to copy from which box and to which box.
Yeah, so you went from one exciting job to another exciting job.
Exactly. And yeah, the reality is I enjoyed my first exciting job, to quote you, a lot more. I think I felt like I had a lot more variety when I was just doing corporate tax compliance. Even though there were a few more zeros on all the numbers, it did seem a little bit Groundhog Day, so it wasn't for me.
So was it when you were at Baker Tilly then when you did your chartered tax advisor exams?
Correct. I mean, anyone who was with me at the time might chortle a little bit at the fact that I didn't technically qualify as a CTA whilst I was there. But I sat my final exams, was possibly a bit confident in my abilities when maybe I shouldn't have been, and I wasn't enjoying the job. So I left, and then shortly after leaving, got the result that I hadn't passed. So I did then resit them a bit later and did get through. So I am a qualified CTA, but yes, I didn't technically qualify as a CTA whilst I was with Baker Tilly. It was slightly after.
Yeah, that's just where you kind of started upon that path. Because then what happened then after Baker Tilly? You left Baker Tilly, and then what did you do next after that?
So I left Baker Tilly to start setting up my own firm. I've never been someone who planned things in advance, much to my wife's distress. So I was kind of a view of, oh, well, I've handed my notice in, and so my first day after my notice period, I'll figure out what's going to work next. So the closest I had to a business plan was sort of jotted down on effectively the back of a cigarette packet. But yeah, so what I went on to do next was start up my own firm. So I got my practicing certificate, things like that, professional indemnity insurance. Rather laughably, I bought a copy of Iris for a year, and it probably took me maybe almost 6 months before I actually used it, and I was halfway through my first annual subscription. But that was the confidence I had when setting out my own versus the reality of winning clients.
Yeah. So if I'm following right, then you handed in your notice, and at that point you didn't know that you were going to set up your own practice.
Well, I did know that I was going to set up my own practice. I just hadn't given a lot of thought as to how. So I figured I'd just worry about that once I started. Okay.
So what made you personally then want to set up your own practice rather than go for another employed job?
A whole bunch of reasons, really. I mean, always in my employed life, I was that annoying guy asking why. And quite often audit is particularly renowned for this, because that's what we did last year, or because that's how we do it. And if at any point, even if you're right and you point out that perhaps the test you're doing is utterly pointless because it's, checking one thing against itself rather than something different, you would just have it repeated, just do it because that's what we told you to do. So, yes, I think as an employee, I was quite irritating, but that's probably, if you feel like that, I think maybe you are destined to be a small business owner or work in a small firm where you're going to be able to have a little bit more control to decide how you do things rather than just, do exactly as you're told, sort of military style. So that was one reason. I think I was possibly always destined to do my own thing, basically by virtue of being annoying. I suppose other things, I'm sure every one of us that's worked in practice and has a charge out rate has looked at our charge out rate and has looked at, worked out what our hourly salary is and thought, there's a very, very big difference between these two numbers. Obviously we're all aware things like we get paid for holiday, study, et cetera, and there's various other costs towards employing. But I think I felt, again, in the early stages, very naively, I felt that it would surely be easy to make a lot more money running my own business.
So are you saying that in reality, then it didn't turn out to be as easy as what you thought?
Certainly in the short term, no, it didn't. So, yeah, the biggest problem was getting the first few clients. I know there will be some people who set out in business, including in accountancy, who will smash this, mainly because they'll have worked out in advance exactly what their ideal client is. They'll know exactly where to find them and they'll know how to pitch to them. So I didn't have any of those things. Prior to setting out on my own, I did speak to at least one sort of small self-employed accountant who was doing reasonably well. And the one thing he stressed to me, make sure you get a niche, because if you don't have a niche, you'll try and appeal to everybody and you won't end up appealing to anyone because you won't ever have a reason for why someone should use you. But me being me, I knew better. Why on earth would I alienate, 50%, maybe 90% of the market by narrowing down my choices? So I tried to be everything to everybody. I tried to be the person that would do small sole trader tax returns. I do, in theory, try and do corporate tax specialism stuff based on the fact of my CTA and my corporate tax experience. But exactly as that guy predicted, I failed to achieve any of those things fairly well. So I did pick up some clients, mainly from networking and, something that seems laughable now, but my first month of being self-employed, I pretty much walked up and down the streets of my local town and the neighboring towns, going into the little shops, especially the independents, seeing if they wanted an accountant. And of course, normally the answer was, I've got one, thanks. But I picked up a few bits and pieces. So I've got no regrets about doing that, because even though my hit rate was very low, and I probably embarrassed myself a fair bit, walking into large chains and talking to perhaps a waiter and him obviously not being in a position of power and me just kind of handing a business card and running away. But in terms of the number of clients I picked up for the time involved, it was relatively good. But there's a limit to how long you can do that for, because you run out of independent shops to walk into.
Yeah. How long do you think it took you then to realise that wasn't going to work and you needed to try something else?
Well, it was probably about the end of the first month that I'd, like I say, in all the local towns, villages, popped my head in at least once. So unless I was going to start traveling to places, 50 miles away, when all of a sudden I'm certainly not your local friendly accountant. And so if I've got no other reason why they should choose me, I can't even rely on the, look, I'm just at the end of your street type thing. So yeah, I suppose it was clear fairly early on that wasn't working. So what else was I doing? I was doing networking. I did have a website. I suppose like a typical person who puts no planning into the business, I was flailing around at lots of different things, hoping that one of them would stick. And the big thing that was a game changer for my business was stumbling across Free Agent. So that's for anyone who doesn't know, the sort of invoicing and bookkeeping app, similar to Xero and Sage, that kind of thing. But this was 11 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. And Free Agent was a tiny little seedling of what it currently is. So I stumbled across them at probably just the right time for me, and to some extent for them, to be an accounting partner. And it really blossomed from there. The main reason being that whether I'd done it deliberately or not, and certainly the answer is no, I hadn't, I now had a niche. So I started, my website started to mention things like Free Agent Friendly Accountant. I spent some time on Twitter searching for people who were tweeting about Free Agent. And increasingly, it was becoming very easy to get clients because there were people who were using the software, nothing to do with me. They just found it themselves. They needed some advice regarding it, tax advice or compliance, whatever it may be. And I was someone who was offering that. And I was one of only a very small number of people offering that, hence why it was quite lucrative at the time.
So your first niche, actually, because I thought you were going to say that you were niche in terms of like the sector that you were going to work for or something, but actually the niche that you had at the time was the software that you used.
Yes, and I mean that realistically, that then decided on the sector as well, because free agent was initially set up by three people who were sort of freelancers, contractors, whichever your preferred term is. And I think they largely built it because they hated using spreadsheets and they thought that they could do something better. So the software was very much aimed at that market. So even though I wasn't particularly aiming at that market, I feel like there's an element in business sometimes of if the river is meandering in a certain way and that's the way it wants to go, flow with it. Don't fight against it. So I wouldn't say that I chose freelancers and contractors. I would say that I fell into it.
You fell into it, but then took advantage of it when you realised it was working, essentially.
Exactly that. Yes. I suppose just to boil it down very simply, with my local stuff, I would be wandering around business to business. I would be up against 5 other accountants that they're also considering, and there's no particular reason to pick me. Whereas, like I say, sort of 11 years ago, clients were coming to find me because of being related to, connected to free agent. So the selling process was made so much easier. And I've never been a natural salesperson. So that was an absolute dream for me, just to pick up the phone and it being someone saying, "Hi there, I've seen you on the internet. I want you to help. Can you?" And me sort of pausing and thinking, well, hold on, do you not want me to talk for a little bit and convince you that I'm good and this, that, and the other? And they pretty much say, no, I want to sign up. Just tell me how to do it.
The dream. So
exactly.
So now you've got your clients coming in and stuff, then that's obviously just one aspect of the business, because I know you've grown it and had numerous employees since. So then kind of when was the time that felt right for you then to start getting your first staff members to help you out, and how did you kind of go about all of that?
Well, that was one area where I was quite lucky. So my mother is a qualified accountant, and she was employed elsewhere, but she was sort of at the age where she was looking towards retiring. But basically, she cut down her hours with what was her day job to start working with me, initially half a day a week. And the reality is that half day I had with her was absolutely invaluable, but probably predominantly using it as a quasi-counseling session for me. Setting up your own business, it's a very, very lonely world. So I suppose anyone who's thinking about it, do be aware of that. Things like networking can help. And if you've got sort of a loving partner or family or close friends around you, that can all help as well. But there will be a lot of things where you will feel like you are on your own and it's all down to you. But yes, gradually as business picked up a little bit, my mum could increase her hours and I could start paying her. It's the only employee I've ever had where I was generally insisting on paying her more and she was trying to argue for less. Don't tend to have that with other staff.
Yeah, I bet. I don't think I'd be able to work with my mum even if it was just for half a day a week. So you obviously navigated that very well.
Well, I think. Yeah, one area why I think it worked well, traditionally, I suppose when you think of parents and child working together, it's normally mother's business or dad's business and the child gets brought into it. And so initially it's fine. The child is learning, they're happy, they're learning and they don't really know what they're doing. But over time, the child starts to get a bit confident and say, come on, mum or dad, look, you're getting a bit stuck in the past. We need to change things. We need to improve things. And the parents are saying, look, sunshine, you don't know you're born. Just keep quiet. We know what we're doing. And I think you have that power struggle. But, we never had that because I suppose it was my business from day one with my mother supporting me rather than it being her business and me supporting her and then trying to take over. So I think because there was never that power struggle, we never really had that problem.
Maybe you'll dislike me using the words luck, but actually I feel like you were quite lucky to be able to have people part-time when you were small, because I imagine paying a full-time salary at that stage would have been a financial burden, and actually having people to come part-time probably helped, would you say?
Massively, yes, because, the business did not have a big turnover at this point. It could not afford to pay big salaries. And which is one of the reasons for, ignore my mother for this purpose, but one of the reasons for going for trainees is that obviously you can pay them less. And I think with that first one starting part-time, yes, the salary's lower, but the thing that's at least as significant is that they are not there, 40 hours a week potentially saying, hey, Chris, what do you want me to do next? Because that's a big responsibility. So, I know a lot of people where if they take on their first employee and suddenly the hours that the founder's doing rocket because they have to spend the normal full-time hours sitting with the trainee, teaching them stuff, reviewing their work, and then the trainee leaves, and then the founder has to, correct that work, do their own work, etc., etc. So, probably the option that a lot of people tend to try to take would be to bring in someone that really knows what they're doing, whether that's full-time or part-time. The dream being that you can pretty much just dump a bunch of files on their desk and say, go on, off you go. But I think, that certainly has its own challenges. One of the really nice things about training up your own staff is I think you get much more of a sense of sort of community and loyalty, I think, because, generally when you're taking on a trainee before working for you, their career isn't great. A lot of the time they may well be on minimum wage jobs, and then you train them up, they become qualified, all of a sudden they're in a position where they can command a salary of, let's say 35,000, something like that as a newly qualified accountant, and you help them to do that. So even if they do decide to move on quickly, I think there's always that loyalty to you. Whereas if someone trained elsewhere and then they come to work for you because it seems like it's a good deal at the time, the second they get a slightly better offer elsewhere, or perhaps it doesn't work, they'll be sort of jumping ship again because there won't be that same sort of long-term relationship that's been built up over the training process.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you actually touched upon a point I think is quite important there, which is kind of training staff. I suppose almost like getting that balance right between spending enough time with them so that you're helpful, but not to your own detriment and stopping you from getting to the things that you need to do. So that's definitely completely relatable for me as well, even though I don't own my own firm. I've helped employ and managed the two most recent trainees in our team. So I've had some experience of that myself. But how do you kind of deal with that then, Chris? How did you deal with it to make sure that you were giving them the support that they needed, but also it didn't get in the way of you also doing the things that you needed to do?
Well, I think that's something that gets easier as time goes on because you end up having sort of multiple staff at various different levels. So, the newest trainee will normally report to the person immediately above them who can answer, maybe 50% of their questions, maybe 75% of their questions. And it's only the particularly tricky ones that then go up to sort of the level above that. Another thing that I think is key, and it's something that I do worry a little about with sort of improvements in technology, is that you need a decent amount of what I would perhaps rudely call donkey work. The kind of stuff that you can just say, look, spend 1 minute telling you this is what you need to do, and then you leave them and it takes them several hours to do it. So in terms of the time input from the more senior member of staff, it's very low. So, when I was training in audit, the typical job would be, right, go and find these 30 invoices from that filing cabinet. So you're trawling through, trying to find them, take them out, photocopy them, often removing staples, then restapling them, putting them back together, all this kind of stuff. But that just doesn't exist anymore because you just copy and paste 30 PDFs from a file to another file. It takes you 2 seconds. But, as time goes on, there are always new repetitive jobs. But I think those are vital because if firms didn't have those repetitive jobs, there would just be no need for trainees. And sometimes it may seem a bit boring as a trainee, but you need there to be those bits of work so that you can justify your wage whilst you're learning around it. I think that's how it works, because if there isn't stuff like that and you literally just turn up and expecting to be taught without you really doing anything useful for the firm, then you're not providing any value to the firm. So why on earth would they employ you in the first place?
Yeah. I think what I've tried to do, and not always with success, is give enough of those repetitive tasks. So as you say, they're almost like justifying their salary and their worth, giving them some new tasks that they're going to find more difficult to like stretch them and give them opportunity to get feedback on something, etc. And then I suppose just giving them almost like self-learning stuff as well at the same time to try and I suppose give them a bit of everything, really. Because obviously, as you say, doing those repetitive tasks, they tend to be, in most cases, dull. You wouldn't want to be doing that all day, every day. They'd probably leave if they're in that situation. And of course, you do want them to progress and kind of flourish as well, don't you? So you still need to give them some stuff. And I'm assuming you do this as well, where you give them the stuff to allow them to grow and develop, give them the feedback, etc. And then as they get better at those more difficult tasks, then you can give them more of that and move them away from the repetitive stuff, and then probably slot in a new trainee to take it over from them at the same time.
I agree with 100% of what you just said. I think the reality is that no one has the brain space to be doing totally new stuff all day, every day. It's just, well, a silly thing we started doing. We always recruit people to start on Wednesdays, because when we did it start on a Monday, you can just see them by halfway through the week, because there's so much new stuff. They're just mentally exhausted. So by starting them on a Wednesday, they've only got 3 days before the weekend. And obviously the second week, it's nowhere near as tricky, because all the things like, where are the different things in the office? What are the names of the various staff members you work with? Stuff like that all becomes familiar quite quickly. But yeah, I agree 100% with what you said. If people aren't going to stay around if they are doing just repetitive stuff all day, every day. And sorry, I certainly don't want to give the impression that that's what we do here. There needs to be that bit of variety, but I think people like to have some things that they can do reasonably early on, where they feel like, oh yes, I know how to do this. I can just get stuck in and do it. Rather than if everything that you're given to do, you need hand holding the whole way through it. I think quite quickly you can start to feel, you will feel as the trainee that you're this massive burden, which isn't a nice feeling to have. So I think you need to have that balance. And exactly, I think it was pretty much the last thing you said. Obviously, one of the joys is that when the next trainee comes on board, right, all of a sudden you've got someone else to pass off some of the most basic things to. So, I think all of the staff know that. So even if sometimes they get a bit bored, there's a clear end date in sight.
Yeah. I think the thing is with the repetitive tasks, actually, you kind of alluded to this, it gives them confidence. It gives them confidence to start growing and trying those things that they've not done before. And I agree with what you said as well, in terms of no one just wants to be doing difficult new things all day, every day. You just can't cope with it. You will only learn so much. So you do need to have those other tasks in there as well, just to kind of balance it out a bit.
Yeah, and even with the repetitive stuff, there will always be some fringe, quirky situations where you'll say, "Oh, I haven't seen this one before." So, I think you just need to be gradually introducing new things to people so that they can cope and are always feeling a bit challenged, but are never feeling overwhelmed. Yeah. It can be tricky to get the balance of those things, but ideally, that's what you want to have. So everyone feels like they're progressing at a rate that they can cope with and they're happy with.
Yeah, agreed. Just a reminder to benchmark your salary, find out what you're worth, or discuss available tax roles. Get in contact with James at the Tax Recruitment Company on 07768 252 252 at j.howell@thetaxrecruitmentcompany.co.uk. Book a call with him via thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. All these contact details are included in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP56. So obviously there came a time then at some point, Chris, where you decided to transfer the ownership of Maslins over to the staff. I suppose what kind of led you up to making that decision, and then tell us a little bit about how that all went down.
Yeah, so being asked why I did this is probably a question I get more than any other. So you'd have thought I'd have nailed down a perfect response. The reality is it was a combination of a bunch of things. So. One of the saddest parts is perhaps that I started to notice that the senior staff members, who at this stage have been with us sort of 6, 7, 8 years, seem to care more about driving the business forward than I did. And I think probably there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, I suppose, the business had been doing well for a while, so I was affluent enough from that. I've never had expensive tastes. So I was kind of the view that, well, any more growth from here means more responsibility on my shoulders, because even if you're doing all the work, legally, the company's mine. And the extra money, I don't particularly appreciate anymore. So, yeah, there was an element of guilt in terms of, we were paying the staff perfectly decent salaries. They were happy. We pay them periodic bonuses. But I was still making comfortable money on top of that. I realise as I say that that's the ultimate first world problem, and no one will have sympathy with that. And I'm not looking for sympathy, but it's still a problem. So yes, I think I was gradually losing interest. I was gradually getting scared about the fact that the more the business grew, the less I really knew what was going on with each client. So it felt like I'm losing control of this, just in terms of I don't really know what's going on. Lots of staff are doing lots of things, and I've got no clue about it. So the EOT, I probably first heard about it, it must be 4 or 5 years ago now. And it ignoring the specifics of it, it sounded nice. I feel like there's a lot of small accountancy practice owners where perhaps the dream is you build it up and then you sell the firm. And I get the appeal. You get a big fat wad of cash. You walk into the sunset. You can either retire or you can start something new. Buy a house outright, whatever it may be. But more often than not, you'd be selling to a bigger competitor or possibly to private equity, something like that. And, quite often what would happen is they say, well, realistically, we're buying your client base. We might keep on a few of your staff short term, but they're going to have to relocate to somewhere totally different. And we're probably going to make half of them redundant, due to synergies in inverted commas. So that it just never sat well, the prospect of doing that, because it seems very much like, well, I will do well out of this, but you staff who have built the business, you won't.
Yeah.
So the EOT seemed to solve that problem in just, I felt like, I refer to it as the guilt-free way of stepping away, that I could sort of either step back or away completely. The staff could step up and, they were very up for it. And I was happy they were competent to do it. So it just seemed a nice thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we then started looking a little bit more detail about the practicalities. Some of your listeners may be aware it's pretty tax friendly. So that the main headlines are that me as the founder selling it, provided I meet certain criteria, I don't pay any capital gains tax whatsoever on the sales price of the firm. And the main perk for the staff is that each tax year they'll be entitled to shares of profits, and up to 3,600 per year is tax free. So it just seems it seemed quite progressive, quite modern, I suppose, quite trendy. Maybe that's a bit cheesy, but I felt like it sat fairly well with our brand. Most of our clients are perhaps, some of them 20-somethings, most of them 30-somethings, a few of them 40-somethings, but they're relatively young, IT-savvy people. On the whole, probably a little bit left-wing. I know there's a theory that we all get more right-wing as we get older. So the employee-owned thing, I felt like our clients would like it. I felt our staff would like it. So it seemed like a win-win-win across the board.
Yeah. I must admit, before you gave me that answer, I wasn't expecting you to say that in response. To be honest, I wasn't sure what I was expecting. I didn't really have anything in mind, but I just wasn't expecting that. That seems like real nice, genuine reasons to have gone down the employee ownership trust route than it was to sell for other reasons. So then what's your involvement now then, Chris, now that you've done the employee ownership trust transfer?
I did a course, so an online course before making the transfer itself. And that seemed to stress to me that basically I needed to go. And if I did hang around, I would be, to use a slightly rude phrase, that bad smell that just wouldn't go away. And I think there can be a risk of that with founders, that, it's not your business anymore, but perhaps you've just got nothing else to do and you're bored. So you wander in, you're looking over people's shoulders, what you doing? And they're too polite to tell you to sod off. So I didn't want that to happen. Anyway, so for about 6 months after the transfer, I deliberately gave the team an extremely wide berth. So I made them know that I was available if they wanted to contact me about anything, but I didn't really go into the office. I didn't check up on them at all. Because I felt that was the right thing to do. Since then, so sorry, just for clarity, we're just coming up, we're just over a year post-transfer. So we transferred end of June 2021. So pretty much up to the end of December, I gave it a very wide berth. I had a chat to the two directors, round about the turn of the year. And, we just sort of talked through what things had I done before that they missed. What things did I want to do? Are there any specific things that I didn't want to do? And so, we just had a nice conversation trying to find where there's an overlap between bits of work that I enjoyed and would like to do and bits of work that they would value me doing. So I suppose, what do I do now? I'm pretty much not client-facing at all. A lot of what I do isn't necessarily high-level stuff. A lot of it's admin. I sort of head up the marketing, although we don't really do a lot of marketing, but to the extent that we do, it's generally me. And I suppose I get to do things like your podcast here, Jack.
Yeah. You can put that down on your timesheet if you do it.
Definitely. Well, we've never had timesheets. I mean, I did them back in my employed days, but no, we don't in our firm. And it's interesting. I think it's one of those grass is always greener things, but I can't see us implementing timesheets anytime soon.
Yeah. So it does sound then like anyway that you've taken a very hands-off approach since the transfer. And I think when we're speaking before we arranged to do this, that can sometimes be to the frustration of your staff. But I would say many tax professionals in particular are probably on the complete opposite side to like being able to just hand things off completely, because we all like the detail so much. So we want to make sure that everything is being done 100% correct. So we check everything to the finest detail. So could you just tell us a little bit about your mindset then to kind of delegation and handing things over so that you kind of don't worry about those finer detail type things that someone like me is probably more inclined to do?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is probably why I'm not suited to being in a high level tax position. I've never been a details person. I'm a big picture person. So I suppose because of that, I've always been happy to delegate. I'm not a control freak, which, does create some risks. Obviously, I can't just win a bit of fancy work and then hand it off to a junior on their first day and say, do that, or we get in an awful lot of trouble. So I suppose that's probably one of the reasons why we have focused on very small businesses. I mean, as we discussed earlier, signing up a free agent was probably a key reason because it was their market. But it then meant, if your clients are relatively modest in value, that obviously doesn't mean it doesn't give you sort of carte blanche to make as many mistakes as you like. But I suppose the professional indemnity risk in terms of giving incorrect tax advice, well, you might have cost the client £100, maybe £1,000. We're not doing multi-million pound deals here where missing something critical could lead to hundreds of thousands of pounds. So I guess that gives us the ability to be a bit more relaxed. And, because when we make mistakes, you can normally quickly rectify them. And even if we can't, worst case scenario, we can tend to say, well, look, sorry about that. We will cover the cost of that. It's rare that happens. When it does, more often than not, I suppose it might be, like a late filing penalty because something slipped off our systems and we missed it.
Yeah. I suppose as well, actually, then, because contractors, I'm imagining in most cases, they're either just a singular self-employed sole trader or through a limited company. That probably makes it more simple as well. So allows you to just hand things over because people can learn what they need to do more quickly than what they could say on a more complex and bigger business.
Yes. I mean, 99% of our clients are limited companies. So, on the one hand, it means like, for our trainees, there is a lot to get your head around because they're typically all registered for that. They all take a salary, even if it's just the national insurance threshold. They take dividends. We've got corporation tax to worry about. You've got statutory accounts. You've got the confirmation statement. And then you've got personal tax, sometimes P11Ds. So, even a one-person company can have an awful lot of things for people to learn. But because pretty much all of our clients are very similar, it does mean that actually the staff can learn that relatively quickly. Whereas, perhaps in a practice that does a much broader base of clients, it will take you a lot longer to become competent at many things because each job you do may have very little correlation with the last.
Yeah. I suppose actually as well, I don't know if this is the way you do it, but you could give someone, say, the VAT returns to do first, get them up to speed on the VAT returns, then train them on, say, payroll if you do single person payrolls, and then teach them how to do corporation tax returns. It's almost like you don't need to be able to do all of it from start to finish. By the sounds of it, you can probably just jump in at one element to do that and then kind of expand that over time so that they can do more and more.
Exactly. And, to some extent we do that. Although, again, I think it perhaps ties back in what we were talking about earlier, trying to keep the staff member enthusiastic. So if you had a staff member only doing VAT returns for a whole year, not seeing anything else, they're probably going to get pretty bored. So it's sort of finding a balance between, look, you know what you're doing on this, so we'll leave you to do that. And then, right, we're going to introduce something new to you here, which we'll have to sit and spend a bit of time with you. I feel kind of got the nice balance of that. But
yeah. Would you say then that there's any drawbacks to your more hands-off approach?
I mean, I think it couldn't work if we had a much wider variety of clients with a lot more, high value transactions, especially if they were sort of quirky stuff. Well, when I say it couldn't work, it could, but I think the risk would be a lot higher. I suppose effectively, because when we're talking about not micromanaging, we are talking about giving people sort of power to make their own decisions. So, I mean, just a very brief anecdote. One of the things that I liked least about my job at Baker Tilly, I could not send an email to a client without it being signed off by a manager first. So, at this time, I was a qualified chartered accountant. Okay, I wasn't a qualified chartered tax advisor, but I couldn't even email a client just saying, thanks for these documents without it being approved first. And part of me understands why, because they didn't want somebody like me thinking, oh, I think I'll have a stab at this complex bit of tax advice. I get that, but I think it was, there was no faith in me to use my own judgment and to decide, am I confident doing this myself? Or, use my own judgment to think, what, I'm not sure on this, I'm going to go and check. So, it's certainly not the case that we just hand stuff to a junior and say, off you go, and I'm not interested in hearing any more about it. You need to finish this yourself. We do spend an awful lot of our time sitting with the juniors, explaining stuff and going through things with them. But it's just, we like to trust them to use their own judgment to think, do I know what I'm doing here, or do I really need a second opinion on this?
I know that now that you have 2 other businesses that you're working on, or even are fully up and running in one case, but MVL Online and EO Go. So I think I'm right in saying that MVL Online is about providing basically an affordable product for voluntary liquidations, which will take advantage of the capital gains tax treatment, and Go EO, which also takes advantage of the tax treatment, although that's not the primary purpose this time. And it's about helping people to become employee-owned, like what you've done with Maslin. So
exactly that. Sorry.
So yeah, you've obviously got a bit of a knack and passion for this since you've done it more than once already. So kind of how do you go about kind of deciding what professional service that you want to build a product around, and then taking it from the idea all the way to building a business around it?
So with MVL Online, it was a legislation change. So back in the day with the Maslins firm, some of our clients would build up pots of cash, and then they would close them down, and there was extra statutory concession C16, which basically meant if you wrote to the revenue and asked them nicely, they say, okay, you can take that final money out and it will be taxed on you as capital gains rather than dividends. I believe it was an EU thing that apparently meant we couldn't have concessions anymore. Things had to be written into law. So ESC C16 was killed off. And the resulting law was that if you had less than £25,000 net assets at the point that you closed your company and you did a strike off, it would be taxed on you as capital. If you had more than £25,000 net assets when you wanted to close down, if you struck your company off, it would be taxed on you as dividends. But for reasons that I don't understand, I didn't make the laws. I don't know why they made them the way they did. But if you've got more than £25,000, you could get capital gains tax treatment, but only if you put your company through a formal members' voluntary liquidation. Now, at the time, that was quite a sort of big, complex formality, which people would very rarely use members' voluntary liquidations. I think generally when we think of liquidations in the accounting world, you think of a business that's gone bust. It can't afford to pay its creditors. But members' voluntary liquidations are different. They're for solvent cases. So the gist of it was I suddenly thought, hold on, this means there's going to be an awful lot of companies out there that want to have an MVL, but their affairs are extremely straightforward. They can boil things down to just being cash at bank and nothing else. So hold on, I think there's going to be a big new market here that just didn't exist before. So I spoke to a couple of insolvency practitioners because I'm not a qualified insolvency practitioner, and you have to be one to be able to do liquidations, whether they're solvent or insolvent. And there was one who was happy to chat to me. I started off and said, what's the cheapest you could do an MVL for? And he said, well, probably about $3,000. I said, okay, imagine that there was only cash at the bank, no creditors, no other assets, no debtors, nothing like that. He's like, well, maybe 2.5. And I said, well, what I'd quite like to do is build a package where we do it for under $1,000. And he pretty much fell off his chair, and I think he might have sworn at me. But he then humored me. So we kept in touch over the next couple of months. And in between him having, proper paid work, I'd be asking him for bits and pieces. And I think, I was younger than him. I'm not related to him, but I think he saw me a little bit like a son, and maybe in a slightly patronising way. He was humouring me by helping me get the various documents I needed to do this. Anyway, I think it then got to the stage where I had a couple of people from the Maslin side that actually wanted this. So I talked to him and said, look, can we actually do these? And he said, yeah, all right. So we agreed on the fee of 995 plus that, doing that typical 99 pence thing. Sounds cheaper than a pound. And it worked. And over time, the numbers that we did grew. And it took a while, but then the insolvency practitioner did later on sort of say he was very, very glad he got involved. And I think even, in its good years, he made more money from that than he did from his mainstream practice. And the reality was, because so much of it streamlined and not quite automated, but certainly systemized, the level of input from him on a lot of cases is quite often just signing a few letters and posting them off. Most of the rest of it we would do.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting, that. And it's funny, isn't it, where he started out at his $3,000, then 2.5, and then suddenly got it down to like just under the grand mark. I think it goes to show, doesn't it, when things are simple and when you can streamline it, you can actually make, I suppose, a good profit by doing it for
the quirks.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So it sounds then like, anyway, at least in that case, the law changed and you just saw an opportunity and went with it. So you didn't like sit down in a room and think, oh, what tax efficiency can I build a product around? It just almost kind of hit you in the face instead. And then you kind of saw the opportunity and ran with it.
Exactly that, yes. It was very much the legislation changed. I vividly remember sitting at my parents' dining room table. For some reason, I was there at the time, and thinking about whether I could do this. And I wasn't an insolvency practitioner, so I wasn't in the perfect position to do this. I had to team up with somebody else. And I was just thinking, well, surely there's plenty of insolvency practitioners out there. At least one of them will have thought, you know what, there's going to be a market here and they'll be in a better place to do this. So maybe I shouldn't bother. But then there was another little part of me that thought, you know what, a lot of times in my life, you hear people use the phrase, oh, I could have done that. Perhaps when Mark Zuckerberg's made billions of pounds off Facebook, and some of my techie geek mates said, well, I could have built Facebook. And I sort of think, well, perhaps you could. I'm not disputing that. But the key thing is you didn't. And he did. So I feel like, I very much, that was in my mind, thinking, I don't want to be that guy that in a year's time sees other firms making loads of money from this and thinking, I actually had that idea and I could have put it in place, but I didn't. So I figured, right, I'm just going to go for it. But yeah, there was no advanced planning. It was purely tax legislation changes, me thinking, oh, there's going to be a new market here that didn't exist before. So we should tailor to that.
Yeah. And I imagine your mate actually in that example probably didn't have the idea to build Facebook. And that's the key thing, isn't it? It's having the idea and then doing something with it. It's not the fact that you can just build it. If you had the idea is actually more important than the building of it, probably, or equally important, let's say. That's probably more fair.
Well, to be honest, I personally would disagree with you on that. I think that, okay, it's good to come up with ideas, but I think a lot of people come up with ideas all the time, but they either just don't implement them because they can't be bothered, or they try to implement them, but they do it very badly. So I think coming up with the idea is like 5% of what's required to make a successful business. I think a lot more of it is in actually making it happen, marketing it so you get the clients, making it so the product is good, and literally just doing it in the first place rather than just thinking about it.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. Actually, ideas are easy to come up with. But obviously you need both, don't you? You need the idea and then you need to do the work at the same time and everything around it to turn it into a business, make it commercial, make it valued by other people, etc.
Yeah, so I mean, realistically, I only had this idea because of the industry I was already in, and some tax rules which I was using, which I then became aware of changed. So, obviously you work in tax, I'm sure every year there'll be tax changes and you'll be thinking, right, how does this impact us? And there might be part of you thinking, oh, perhaps there's a new opportunity here that didn't exist before.
Yes, absolutely. Obviously, you've got to then turn it into a business, the idea that you talked about, like the one with the members' voluntary liquidations. And part of that is getting clients. Now, with Maslins, it sounds like you fell upon the goldmine, really, which was free agent, and that helped big time with that. How have you done it with your other businesses?
Well, I think of the three, MVL Online was probably the easiest. And I think the reason being, that there were a lot of accountants out there with clients that knew their clients needed a members voluntary liquidation. So, we weren't inventing a new product that didn't exist before. We were basically just a product that existed and lots of people provided. The demand for it was going up and we were offering it significantly cheaper than others out there. So, we didn't really have to do much selling. People knew that they wanted what we were selling and we offered it cheaper than all the competition. So that made it fairly easy. I think with Maslins, it was a lot harder because I had an awful lot of competitors. I wasn't cheaper than all of them. Probably I was cheaper than some of them. And I think when all of us set out on our own in accountancy, we tend to drift towards the cheap end because you just want people to choose you. And it's an easy-ish way of making you more appealing. So I think with GoEO, one of the problems I've got is that EOTs are still relatively unknown. So, there's two separate parts to the selling process. You first got to make people aware and make them aware that this might be something that they want. And then secondly, you've got to convince them that you're the one to provide it. So whereas with MVL Online, people knew they wanted it and they were just trying to find the provider, or indeed when Maslin started using Free Agent, they knew they wanted an accountant that worked with Free Agent and then they would come searching for us. A lot of people who maybe have businesses that might be suitable to go employee owned, and they might actually want it, they don't know that they want it, so they're not searching for it in the first place. So there's that building awareness, which is something that obviously we're not the only ones doing that. There's lots of people gradually growing awareness for employee ownership, but it makes it harder to sell.
That's where actually I think it's where like tax advisor or accountants and stuff can actually work together to get a message out there. I know we see everyone as competition, but that awareness point, if everyone gets together and makes like the whole world aware of something, then obviously there's more opportunities for everyone there to go out there and win the work. So it's where I kind of see it being good that you can kind of work with other firms, or not necessarily work with them, but not against them per se in building the awareness. Obviously only at the point where you're competing against them to win the actual project once they want it.
Yes, and I mean, one of the things that I think I've only recently come to realise with regards to GoEO is that whilst it's still a small market, and I'm not disputing that at all, it is a small market. To give you an idea, in the last 3 years, there have been about 500 EOT transfers, so about 160, 170 a year. So it's not a huge number. But most of them are done by a small number of law firms, effectively. There's probably about 5 reasonably big names. And the reality is that because EOTs are starting to grow in popularity, most of those law firms don't have a huge capacity. And so they want to sort of cherry pick a little bit more the cases that they want, which generally is the bigger, more complicated ones that they can justify charging much higher fees. So the very positive side of that for me is that increasingly I'm realizing that these people aren't competing with me. If anything, there's an argument that I'm sort of offering them, or not offering them a favor, I'm helping them out, because the clients that come to them say, hey, I want to use, I want to become an EOT, can you help me do it? And they say, yes, but it's going to cost you, say, £30,000. And the client's haggling them very aggressively on fees. It gives that lawyer the opportunity to basically say, well, look, we can't come down any lower on fees, but they can look a little bit helpful by saying, why don't you try that firm over there that are significantly cheaper, rather than just saying, no, go away, we can't help. So, yeah, I think when you've got a growing market, then competition, like you say, can generally work alongside each other rather than fighting each other for the same client.
Yeah. And then actually where you having your niche with the small market all the time, the people who focus on the bigger stuff, they don't see you as competition then? Like you just talked about the lawyers, they probably see you more as a compliment to what they do.
Yeah, I would certainly say I don't think they see me as competition. There's probably an element of, a lot of them probably haven't heard of us yet. We are very new. We're not a big name in the industry. And even if they have, they are probably a bit dismissive. But having said that, I think that there would be a lot of, liquidated firms that provided MVLs that would have felt the same way about MVL Online, and then perhaps a year or two in, maybe regretted being a little bit dismissive. So I'm not saying GoEO is going to take over the world, far from it. But I think that, there's something nice about being the plucky underdog, which is what we are at the moment. It's the little firm. It's basically just me. Most of it's going to be remote, charging far less than. and offering something which on paper is very similar. I'm not going to claim that I'm offering a directly comparable package, because there'll be a lot of sort of expertise that they have that I do not have. And I'm not trying to argue against that, but it's an option that's there. Like I said, I feel it's a little bit like, do you want the coffee table from the master craftsman or from IKEA? If you're happy going along with the same one that a bunch of other people have got exactly the same thing, but it does the job, great.
So kind of looking back then now, Chris, knowing what you know now, if you could give your younger self some career advice, what do you think that would be?
Well, the reality is that the younger me wouldn't have listened, so it probably wouldn't matter what career advice the older me did. And if I'm honest, I do feel like we've all got to find our own way. I'm very much someone who learns from my own mistakes, which is partly because perhaps I don't necessarily listen to the advice of others. And I think to do that to an extent, there's no harm whatsoever in listening to other people and taking their wisdom. But I think this is something that applies very much in the business world, that you hear a lot of people saying you learn a lot more from your failures than from your successes. And I think that's so true, because if something goes well overall, you don't really look at the intricate details. But the reality is probably there were some things that were total fluke and meant that even though you mucked up some other things quite badly, overall it went well. Whereas when things fail, that's when you sort of look at the detail and think, right, why did this go wrong? What could I do differently next time? So I'm kind of the view that we all need to bumble our way through life, making lots of mistakes. But the most important thing is making sure that we learn from them.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. I am also similar to you in that I'm quite stubborn and probably sometimes don't take on the advice of others as much as I should. And I also learn a lot from my mistakes. So maybe that's just part and parcel of being naturally stubborn.
Quite possibly.
So for those then who are kind of at the start of their career journey then, Chris, or anyone who just wants to kind of progress and develop their tax careers, I know you've accounting and tax, but what do you think that your kind of top 3 or few tips are for them, for those who want to do that?
I think the key one is trying to work out which bits of the job do you enjoy. So, for example, for me, it became fairly clear fairly early on that the more technical aspect, I wasn't that interested. So, going to work in corporate tax compliance was a bad choice for me. I mean, I've got no regrets about doing it, and I learned a lot from it, but I was not happy there. And the reality is just that the most important thing in whatever work you do, you have to be happy with it. Because generally, if you enjoy it, you're going to care more, you're going to become good at it. And if you become good at it, you're going to be successful at it. So figuring out what part of the role you enjoy is the most important thing, and trying to do as much of that. And where there's bits that you don't like, assuming you're working with someone else, speak to your manager about it. I mean, use your appraisals as a chance to moan, basically, in a nice way. Moan about the things that you don't like. And if you've got a good manager, which, when I was at Tennant, I had a bunch of brilliant managers. They did their absolute best to try and tailor the job around what I wanted. And I'm forever grateful for that, because it just meant that I got to do more of the work that I did enjoy. So I enjoyed working with clients, speaking to clients about their businesses. I enjoyed working on smaller clients, and a large part of that, I think, was because I could see the whole thing through. One of the downsides of working on an audit for a huge client is they kind of say, right, you go off and you audit trade debtors, for example. So you spend the whole week looking at trade debtors, and a different staff member's doing the fixed assets, someone else is doing the bank, and so on and so forth. And okay, partly it might be a little bit boring, but it doesn't give you a good overview of how everything fits together. So a little bit like you talked earlier about getting someone to do VAT returns all day, every day. I think you need to be able to understand how everything fits together, because even if what you're doing perhaps seems possibly repetitive, possibly boring, if you understand how it fits into the bigger picture, and that helps you understand why it's important, which then makes you feel worthwhile.
Yeah. And I agree with the point you said earlier, actually, about, I suppose, doing stuff that you enjoy, because you will automatically, I agree, try harder at it, want to become better at it, and then almost like as a consequence of that, just naturally be more successful because of it. So yeah, I think that's definitely one to hit home for a lot of people.
And I think the other thing is that we all need a bit of variety in our work. And I suppose one area which I perhaps haven't had this is because the businesses I've been involved in have very much ended up being a case of, right, this is the kind of client we look at. We basically won't touch anything that deviates too much from that. That does mean that there's not a lot of variety in terms of, what we do for each client. A lot of it is going through the motions. But that's perhaps partly why I've enjoyed the running a business side of it, because there is a lot of variety in terms of that. So my day job over the last 12 years has included managing staff, looking at the finance of the business, doing some marketing, various things along those lines. So, but I think, equally, there'll be plenty of people who will love the technical stuff. And the key thing that they will enjoy will be getting the variety that one day they're working on, I don't know, a multinational group. The next, they're dealing with a small business. Sometimes it's in property, sometimes it's in tech. And that's how they get the enjoyment and the learning. I think we all need to be learning. We all need to have a bit of variety, but there's different ways you can get that variety.
Yeah, agreed. So for anyone, Chris, who wants to kind of learn more about you, where's the best places for them to go?
I've been a lot more active on LinkedIn over the last year or so. Probably prior to that, I used it like most people did a decade ago, of it basically being an online CV. So yeah, LinkedIn, Chris Maslin. I'm not the only Chris Maslin. There's not very many of us. I think I'm the only one in the UK. Otherwise, check out the various websites. So yeah, Maslins, MVL Online or GoEO. If you search for those, you should be able to find me very, very easily.
For all other episodes of Tax Career Success Secrets, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TCSS. A link will be contained in the show notes also, which can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP56. The show notes will also contain all the links and details as promised throughout this episode. The next episode of the Tax Professionals podcast is with Mark Lee, and it's on the topic of winning more tax work. To make sure you don't miss out on that episode and all future episodes, subscribe or sign up for email notifications. thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. The emails give you a brief summary of episodes, which are bi-weekly and released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.